All right, so I'm going to blame Charles just because it's fun to blame other people. I told somebody this morning, us ministers get it. It's always better and more fun to spend other people's money, right? Get out that old church credit card and just go to town. I probably don't need help. I'm pretty good at it. But the other part of that is Charles was trying to extend this class. I was supposed to finish today, and he put a little bug in my ear last week, so I'm going to talk about that this week. And he's not even here, so I'll tell you what a rowdy crew. He is here in spirit. Hopefully he's with us online. And what's that? I don't either. So we've been going over biblical archaeology, and I've spent the last few weeks on what the church in the first century was up against, what they were facing. And the persecution was, it was ironically widespread, but it was also isolated. So there wasn't this blanket persecution where if you were a Christian, you were doomed. But at the same time, there were isolated pockets of persecution, and they were severe. And I think sometimes we read through the Scripture, and especially in the Restoration movement, we're so programmed to be patterned. And so we look for this blueprint in Scripture and, how to do church, which isn't a bad thing. But I think when we do that and when we really focus on reading the Bible through the lens of a blueprint, we miss the wider context. And the wider context is really important because Christians genuinely faced a real threat of persecution. And not 21st century American Western culture persecution where somebody says something mean online and Christians are like, oh, we're so persecuted. That it is not persecution. We are not being persecuted in the United States of America. Some people want to call it that, but we're not persecuted. I don't know of Christians in America who are losing their life, who are being tortured because of their faith. Picked on, yes, but that is not persecution. Persecution is tremendous suffering, and I think we really do an injustice to the people who legitimately are suffering persecution right now across the globe when we call mean-spiritedness persecution. So persecution in the first century, with the spread of the Roman government, with really starting with before Herod the Great, continuing and amplified with Herod the Great, and then on and on and on. Herod Antipas, or also known as Herod the Tetrarch, who had John the Baptist beheaded, and did all kinds of other policies that just really damaged both Jewish people and Christians, Christ followers, I guess, at that point. It was pretty widespread.
I heard one guy say in a seminar that when emperor worship was demanded, that's when the seven churches in Asia,
Yeah.
one of the reasons that John was writing to them,
Yeah.
was because they were demanding, the Roman Empire was demanding that they worship the emperor.
Yeah.
And the Christians, no way, shape,
Yeah.
or form.
With the exception, and Charles brought this up after we had read the Pliny-Trajan letter. When Pliny, the governor, wrote Emperor Trajan, which was roughly around that time, 110 AD, we were in the height of persecution. It was really ramped up. That just ushered in a whole nother level of severe and gruesome persecution. And we're going to talk about the Catacombs again today, thanks to Charles, and how they had to hide and Christians would bury the dead underneath the streets in Rome. And you had miles and miles of catacombs. But yeah, certainly, with Emperor Nero, he ushered in just mass executions of Christians in Rome. That spread throughout the empire. By 110 AD, there were two truths, really three truths that were at play, and all pretty much equal. One, persecution was real, it was widespread, it was severe. And you're right about emperor worship. Christians were forced to bow down. In fact, when Pliny writes Trajan, he said, I set up an image to you and would give them 3 chances to recant. If somebody came and it was reported that they were a Christian, I would give them 3 chances. I would torture them, give them 3 chances to recant, and they would bow down to an image of you. So persecution was real. The church was growing wildly in the midst of persecution. When Pliny wrote Trajan in 110 AD, he said, our temples are to the point where they're not frequented, meaning the pagan temples were emptied out. Then he puts this caveat, which is point number 3, that there were Christians who were recanting Christianity. He said in the letter, and I don't have it put up again, we put it up a couple weeks ago, but Pliny wrote to the emperor and he said, we're starting to have an effect. This policy of torturing Christians is starting to have an effect. And then he said, people are starting to come back to the temples. So there is evidence that there were Christians who were caving to that pressure. And I think if we really put ourselves in that context, some of the common tactics were to torture parents in front of kids to the point of death. And then they would turn to the kids and say, will you bow down and worship the emperor? If you put yourself in the shoes of those kids who witnessed that, of course, a terrified kid who doesn't know a whole lot better, who just witnessed one or both of the parents being executed slowly and painfully, would be likely to recant Christianity to stay alive. And then they would do the reverse of that. They would torture and execute kids in front of the parents, and then ask the parents, do you still profess Jesus Christ? So there is evidence that there were Christians who were turning away. To what number, we don't really know. But Charles made that point, and he said, this wasn't like you were a Christian, you died a Christian no matter what, because there is evidence that Christians would recant and they would denounce Jesus to stay alive. And I think it's kind of easy for us to go back and say, well, I would die for Christ. I've said it, yeah. And then he was quick to deny Christ, right? 3 times. But I think it's easy to say that when there's absolutely zero threat of us losing our lives because of Jesus Christ. Because and that's not to fault us, but the only experience that we have is the experience of hypothetical. What if somebody came in and demanded that we bow down to an image and renounce Jesus? Would we do it? Or not? No, I wouldn't do it. Well, how do you know? And so, I hope we can be sensitive to the fact that creating those hypotheticals and using those as sermon illustrations and things like that. Now I'm talking to me and you, Roy. Using hypotheticals when we've never experienced any level of persecution can be insensitive. But that's not to say that we shouldn't think about those things either, because absolutely we should think about those things. But if we stand up there and we say, I would die for Christ if I was being tortured, and we kind of puff our chest out for Jesus, and I go back and I look at historically, the reality is, I couldn't in my wildest dreams imagine I can't even think about it. Having any of my kids and seeing their faces being tortured and murdered in front of me because of Jesus Christ, but that was the reality. It was happening. And it wasn't a small minority of, there were pockets, but there were big pockets. So it's not like this little tiny group of 15 Christians in the world. This was happening regularly. Nero slaughtered how many people? I mean, tens of thousands of Christians. So I'm going to look at some of the scriptures, and then we'll talk about the catacombs, and kind of, I would say clean that up, but Charles wants me to dirty it up, because he said I made it too clean last week. And I kind of agree with him, because it was gruesome. It was ugly, the things that Christians were facing. Matthew 24. And Roy, we've talked a lot about this, all of chapter 24. We've had a lot of phone conversations about Matthew 24. Is Jesus foretelling the future, or is he talking about present day, what was going to happen shortly after his death? My stance is both and. Certainly the destruction of the temple happened in 70 AD. It was completely destroyed. It's estimated by Josephus that 100,000 Jews in Jerusalem, they either lost their lives or were sold into slavery. So, you wrap your mind around that number. 100,000 is a lot of people. This was bloody, this was gruesome, this was ugly. There's no way to sanitize what happened in Jerusalem in AD 70. Matthew 24, starting in verse 1. Jesus left the temple and was going away. When his disciples came to point out to him the buildings of the temple. But he answered them, you see all these, do you not? Truly I say to you, there will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down. Now, first of all, I want to talk about that just very briefly, just to remind you guys. You saw the pictures of how big some of the stones were. You guys visited in person. Some of these stones that were left underground, and there are some above ground, but they're massive. Tons and tons and tons and tons each of these massive stones. And it was pure, brilliant white. Limestone, when it was all polished up, was glistening white. I mean, blinding white. And so for Jesus' disciples to look at that and to physically they were staring at the temple, which was not that old. Herod's additions, building it on the Temple Mount, building the Temple Mount, expanding it, making this modest temple into this huge, massive structure literally on the side of a billy goat path. The amount of dirt and walls and retaining walls that it took to build this Temple Mount out was absolutely phenomenal. And so clearly in this passage, Jesus' disciples are infatuated with it, with the infrastructure. Jesus just clearly points it out. You see these? Not one stone's going to be left on top of each other.
Plus you have to take the emotional pull.
Yeah.
The Jews.
Yeah.
This was God's city, the chosen place to worship.
Yeah.
They weren't supposed to worship anywhere else except Jerusalem.
Yeah.
His temple, and some of the remnants probably from King David, special. All of that mixed in with the beauty of it.
Yeah.
That would be hard.
And also the emotional history of the temple being overtaken and being destroyed before, and the Maccabean revolt when pagan people came in and were offering pigs, which was absolutely desecrating the temple, and then they got it back, and then it was restored to them. and it was enlarged, and it was just this big, powerful symbol of what God is capable of. So yeah, you're absolutely right. The emotional attachment and just the deep spiritual connection, it was massive. And so for Jesus to say this, I would imagine, would be really offensive or confusing or both. Then he goes on, Matthew continues, as he sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciple came to him privately saying, "Tell us, when will these things be, and what will the sign of your coming and the end of the age?" And Jesus answered them, "See that no one leads you astray. For many will come in my name, saying, 'I am the Christ,' and they will lead many astray. You will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not alarmed, for this must take place." Well, wait a second. I thought Jesus would protect us. I thought that as Christ followers, that we were going to have this hedge of protection and nothing bad would happen to us. And if you pull into Walmart and there aren't any parking lots and you pray, one's going to open up because you're a Christian, right? And Jesus says no. These things are guaranteed to happen. They must take place. But the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All these are but the beginning of the birth pains. That's not the most promising news, is it? At least on the surface. See, think about all the things that we put our stock in, and I've talked about this over the last few weeks. We are addicted to comfort. We're addicted to complacency. We're addicted to normalcy. We're addicted to just this tight structure where everything is known. Where we have computers that predict, and when you get on an airplane with extreme precision. That thing not only takes you from point A to point B, but they can predict to the second when the wheels are going to touch down. We like predictability. And I know that we like predictability because I've been to other countries that are not so predictable as our country. And it is frustrating. We landed in Haiti back in 2019. Eden and I went with Bill and Mary Ann. And Bill had prearranged to get a rental car, so we go to the rental place. And about an hour and a half later, and a lot of twisting of arms, and my sister Stephanie in Haitian Creole kind of getting aggressive with the guy behind the counter. An hour and a half later, and there was only one other customer in there, we were leaving. So we're sitting in the blistering heat. That's just life over there. It's not predictable the way it is here. We're addicted to predictability. And so Jesus is telling them that this is wildly unpredictable. That you think the end is going to be here, it's not. It's not even getting warmed up. This is just birth. This is just the beginning of what's going to happen. And then they'll deliver you up to tribulation and put you to death, and you will be hated by all nations for my name's sake. And then many will fall away and betray one another and hate one another. By the way, this isn't something that Jesus tells them and they're like, no, that could never happen. They were witnessing it. They were seeing these things happen. They witnessed it with John the Baptist. They were seeing other disciples. Look at how many times disciples were put into prison. They were beaten. They were flogged. They were put in prison. They were witnessing these things. So it's not like this was a distant reality, something that could happen in the future. It was happening. And Jesus says that when you see things that get worse, including the temple be destroyed, if you think that's the end of time, things aren't even beginning. And many false prophets, verse 11, will arise and lead many astray. And because lawlessness will be increased, the love of many will grow cold. But the one who endures to the end will be saved. What's Jesus' message? Yeah. Be alert. Be vigilant. Be faithful. Don't put your time and money and energy and life into things that are not eternal, into things that don't matter. Isn't that Jesus' message throughout his ministry? Don't put your time in things that don't matter, because you're not guaranteed the next minute. Be faithful to the end.
Jimmy, wasn't it Josephus that said, when they surrounded Jerusalem the first time, in, I don't know if it was 66 AD or whatever.
I think 68 was the first time. Yeah.
And during that time, the Christians evacuated.
Yeah.
No Christians were killed in the destruction of Jerusalem. And then the Roman army came around, and then they finished it off after that.
Yeah. And if you can imagine, too, I mean, it's kind of the lone survivor plague that people feel, because there's a tremendous amount of guilt that goes along with that, too. Where, yeah, it's great that you survived, but lots of people didn't. And the Christians didn't have disdain toward their fellow Jewish friends and family. The Jewish people were people they preached to constantly. So, yeah, I mean, there's just so many different layers of grief. And that's what the reality was for Christians in all of the first century. And there were these different waves of severe persecution. Verse 14, and this gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. So again, it's this message: don't give up, don't stop believing, don't stop telling people the good news of the gospel, which is what? Salvation, mercy, hope. I mean, in a nutshell, Jesus is saying this life here on earth stinks pretty badly. It's full of pain. It's full of people who betray you. It's full of people who persecute you. It's full of people who are full of hate. Don't be like that. Be faithful. Share the good news with people, because this is their reality. Whether they're Christian or not, people are being persecuted. People are dying. Be kind, be compassionate, be full of mercy. Remember people who are suffering, right? Didn't Jesus say, James said, the brother of Jesus said, pure and undefiled religion is this: to remember the orphans and the widows in their distress. That's an important clause, in their distress. And to keep oneself unstained from the world. If you want to know what pure religion is, it's not packing your worship houses and seeing how loud you can sing and how good you feel when you leave the doors. He could have said, pure and undefiled religion is having a wallop of a worship service where you make everybody feel so much better about themselves when they leave that they're walking on cloud 9 for the rest of the week. Right? Yeah, I mean, that's not pure and undefiled religion. Pure and undefiled religion is hard. It's sitting with people on the ash heap when their whole world burned down around them. And that's exhausting and beautiful. I came from a viewing this morning where we gathered around a family at a casket and prayed with the family. And I see little kids who are weeping at the casket of their dad. That's pure and undefiled religion. Not feeling great about yourself when you leave and, being like, Jesus loves me, and hang your little bumper sticker or your little cross on your mirror in your car and feel good about yourself. That's not pure and undefiled religion. As good as we might feel inside by hanging the cross on the mirror, that's not what pure and undefiled religion is. So Jesus, makes this point over and over and over and over again. You're going to see some really ugly, awful, bad, horrible things, and you're going to be the target of them. Stay faithful to the end.
And if you were in a Muslim country, driving down the street, you better not have that cross hanging from your mirror.
Yeah.
You might find out what the persecution is.
Yeah. And a lot of people are. I mean, look at the number of underground Christians in the world. I mean, millions of Christians who are underground right now because they have to be. It's out of necessity. That's their reality. So I think we've been really hurt. We've hurt ourselves. We've hurt the church. We've hurt the image of Christ when we've developed this Christianity that's this feel-good, like it's this hip, come in and, just be laid back and, we're going to wear ripped jeans and just, be the cool hip church. We've really hurt the image of Christ because that's a shallow view of Christianity. I'd rather see people come in rags and genuinely ripped up clothes, not people who purchased them that way, but people who can't afford to buy clothing that's not tattered, who are just out there doing life and sitting with people and suffering with people, crying with people, sharing hope with people, laughing with people. Okay, Catacombs. I promised I would get to it. So we talked a lot about it last week. And the catacombs were like each tunnel was like 6 to 9 miles long. And there were tons of these veins, 6 to 9 miles long, 4 to 6 tiers. And you saw the pictures last week, right? On both sides of these aisles, super high ceiling, back to back to back to back places to place the dead. You're talking hundreds of thousands of tombs. And that was not a Christian idea. Christians didn't invent the catacombs, but they certainly ramped up the production of catacombs. And they were digging. They had people. I forget what they were. I think they were just called grave diggers. But they would dedicate day and night to digging these tombs out. And Christians, because persecution was so severe within that time frame, around Nero in 64 AD, up to the time when Revelation was written, persecution was still really severe. Christians had to hide. They couldn't even bury their dead. Well, first of all, in Rome, pagans would cremate. They would cremate the dead. Christians wouldn't do that. And Jewish people would not cremate because of the resurrection. Your body is raised up. And so they would preserve the body. So they had to bury the dead. They couldn't bury the dead in the city. There was a city ordinance where you couldn't bury the dead in the city. They couldn't carry the dead out of the city because a lot of the people were dying from persecution. So if you're carrying the casket of a Christian, if you're carrying a casket at all, what do they know about you? You're not a Roman pagan, because he would have cremated the body. So that would have outed you as a Christian or a Jewish person, which would have been imminent death for a lot of people. So they had to hide and go down into the catacombs and keep digging out the catacombs. Up on top of the soil, Christians were dying in mass numbers because of persecution. Under the soil, people were digging and burying the dead. And we talked about that last week, but what Charles brought up is he said, can you imagine the stench, the lack of oxygen that's down there, combined with decaying bodies all around you? It's this ugly picture of disease. which meant that lots of grave diggers were dying because of disease. And Charles is much more of a historian than I am.
Down did they dig?
Down to 60, I think 66 feet below surface is the deepest catacomb.
Create sinkholes on the surface?
I don't think as of yet there have been, and they've been around, for thousands of years.
Yeah.
And I think it's just because of the type of rock. It's lava rock. It's a soft rock, and I guess it's like our deep mines today. They dig them out, and if you dig them right, it stays secure. But I think that was important for Charles for us to bring that up, and I think he's right that was just one more component to the ugliness of what it meant to be a Christian. That it wasn't just persecution. I mean, that's bad enough, but it didn't stop with the persecution. They had to hide even when they did funerals. At a time when you should be free to grieve and free to cry out and free to scream and wail and whatever it takes to grieve the loss of your loved one, they couldn't do it. They had to hide. And people would go down there, and the people who were digging out were dying. It was just this vicious cycle of death and disease, persecution, death, disease. That was the environment Christian children were being brought up in. And, I feel guilty sometimes because I've been that parent where I'm like, boy, I really fear for my kids. Right? And they're legitimate concerns. It's not like we're pretending that we're fearful for what environment our kids are going to be raised in. But I go back and I think back to the first century, and I'm like, what would it have been like to be a parent to say, I'm going to submit to Jesus Christ in baptism. And we're going to be a Christian family. We're going to follow Christ. We're going to deny ourselves, take up our cross, and follow Jesus, like he said, unto death. Can you imagine what it was like for parents to raise your kids in that kind of an environment? The hostility towards Christianity, the very real threat that you and or your kids could be persecuted and tortured in the most severe ways. That if there was a death in the family, you would have to hide and bury them underneath in these rancid, disease-prone catacombs underneath the city. You couldn't even have a proper burial. And while some people did renounce Christ, a whole lot of Christians didn't. And we have evidence from the church fathers in the in the second century, and into the third century, where they give account after account after account of martyrdom. Graphic accounts of martyrdom. Of people who refused to denounce Jesus. I think that ought to be our hope, and that's kind of my message as we go through this class. Like I said, I don't want it to be about, oh, isn't that architecture really cool? Isn't it cool that they dug up, thousands of year old history? It is cool, but the deeper issue is our faith. That we owe our lives to Christ, that we need to live out pure and undefiled religion, period. Because the world still, even in our spoiled culture, the world's suffering right now. It's bleeding. People are hurting. And it's our job as Christians to seek them out and to give them hope in the only place that it can come from. All right, we are out of time. We're going to stop there and pick up in a little bit. Thanks, guys.